Welcome to World Business. Today we examine a deal that's already sending shockwaves through the global economy. On July the 23rd, President Donald Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba struck what both sides hailed as a massive breakthrough. A $550 billion trade and investment pact that averts steep new tariffs, expands US market access, and redefines the bilateral relationship between two of the world's largest economies. Now, under the agreement, both sides settle on a 15% reciprocal tariff for key goods, avoiding the previously threatened 25 to 30% rates. Japan has also pledged unprecedented investment through loans and guarantees, while the US opens doors to its auto and agricultural sectors. In return, Japan receives security assurances and major defense contracts. But the impact goes far beyond Tokyo and Washington. This agreement follows a series of Trump-era deals with the UK, Vietnam, and others, redrawing the map of global trade and applying fresh pressure on Europe, China, and multilateral frameworks like the WTO. So what does this deal really mean for growth, inflation, trade stability, and investor confidence? First, let's take a look at this report.
Japanese shares surged to a one-year high on Wednesday. Investors were excited after the country struck a trade deal with the US, which lowered tariffs on autos. The move revived hopes for an agreement between the EU and US, which also boosted European stocks. Donald Trump said a trade deal with Tokyo would include Japan paying a lower than threatened 15% tariff on shipments to the US. The Nikkei index jumped 3.5% following the news as shares of automakers surged. Mazda was the biggest riser at almost 18%, while Toyota and Subaru also saw big jumps. South Korean automakers rose too as analysts grew hopeful over potential progress in tariff negotiations between Seoul and Washington. Trump further said representatives from the EU were due to meet for trade negotiations on Wednesday. That raised hopes for a deal with Europe, although the EU is reportedly refining countermeasures in case of a deadlock before the August 1st deadline. The European Stoxx 600 index rose 1% early Wednesday, with auto shares surging around 4%. Car giant Stellantis was among the top gainers, rising around 7%.
Well, joining me now to unpack the full picture is our special guest, Mark Humphrey-Jenner, an Associate Professor of Finance at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Mark, great to see you. Let's start with the basics then. What are the key economic wins for each side in this new US-Japan agreement?
Well, so we're looking at this deal. There's wins really for both sides. From the US perspective, well, they've got a 15% tariff, whereas they had a 0% tariff before the tariff negotiations kicked off. And in addition to this, they're getting about $550 billion worth of investment into the United States, which President Trump has indicated he might be able to direct, at least to some extent. Now, those are the major wins there for the United States. For Japan, there are also significant trading partner. It's gotten its tariff down to 15%. Versus the 25 to 30% that had been threatened beforehand, admittedly higher than the 0% they were facing last year, but still significantly less bad than it could have been. And this in particular is good for Japan's economy, given that autos are their largest export. So in essence, we're seeing wins on both sides. Furthermore, it draws together security relationships between the two countries, which helps Japan out in areas like the South China Sea.
And Mark, it's a huge amount of money this, isn't it? $550 billion deal. How is that going to help sort of reshape bilateral ties, do you think? And what strings just might be attached?
Well, the $550 billion is at least stated to be an investment. So it does appear that Japan is not necessarily just losing that money, but of course it does depend on the terms of that. And that's really been hammered out at the moment. Now, President Trump's indicated he might be able to direct some of where that money is going, which suggests it might go to things such as AI or generating more manufacturing jobs within the United States. Some of it might also come through corporate investment, And we already see quite a lot of that. So, for example, Toyota in Texas, for example, with their factories and their offices in Plano. So we're likely to see the US focus where that investment is, and it gives us an idea of the types of agreements the United States would really like to see in the future, ones that bring investment into the United States. And that partly underscores why they removed that so-called revenge tax from the Big Beautiful Bill, that Section 899, that would have potentially enabled the US to raise taxes on incoming investment. This underscores why that would have been, well, perhaps not desirable as well.
And a major reduction mark in the reciprocal tariff level, 15%. That's a major, major shift. How do you think that benchmark might affect other trade partners, especially the EU and China?
We're definitely seeing many of these tariff rates come down to maybe 15% being the lowest. So Japan has gotten the lowest of these so far, although there still are many deals to be negotiated, at least the lowest for countries running a trade surplus with the United States. Vietnam came in at 20%, and it gave the United States some additional things as well for that 20%, such as 0% tariffs on US imports into Vietnam. So seeing areas like this really show up in the tariffs. So with us looking at the EU, it's quite possible the EU will be facing a tariff of a similar magnitude, particularly since the EU appears to be stuck on things like digital services taxes and additional regulatory requirements on US tech companies. That appears to be one of the stumbling blocks that has really been going on in the background of the US-EU negotiations, but it does give us some good news for many of the European auto manufacturers. I've been looking at this trade deal thinking, well, the auto tariffs will go down to that lower rate, rather than potentially a higher rate they'd otherwise been fearing.
And Mark, these are major material amounts, no question, but there's also some symbolism in this potential deal as well. I mean, Japan have agreed to remove auto caps and buy 100 Boeing aircraft, for example. Do you think some of this is also about diplomacy rather than just economics?
Absolutely. So President Trump has signaled with many of these trade negotiations that part of it is due to trade rebalancing. In his view, overseas countries are imposing trade and non-trade barriers on US goods, and he wants to rebalance that, or at least that's one of the stated objectives. But some of it as well is geopolitical. And we can see this play out in many countries. So to give you an example, with Vietnam, part of the negotiation enabled the US investing more in Vietnam. So that is increasing the beachhead overseas. If you look at Mexico, part of it comes down to the allegations of fentanyl crossing the border. If we look at China, part of that would come down to fentanyl precursors. So many of these tariff negotiations also involve other geopolitical or policy goals as well. With Japan, it might be shoring up and bolstering an ally that the US might see as a counterweight to China. And that might also underscore the type of relationship they have with South Korea, but also, if and when it comes to it, how the United States deals with other trade-related negotiations, such as the AUKUS security agreement with Australia, as an example.
And we've spoken about the auto sector, the agricultural sector. What other sectors do you think might stand to benefit from this deal? And are there any that you think might actually be squeezed?
Well, sectors that are more likely to be squeezed are probably the more clear-cut here. In particular, in this trade deal, heavy metals such as, well, steel or aluminium, those are not included in the trade deal. They're still going to be subject to the 50% tariff. So relatively speaking, they are a loser from this trade deal, a significantly higher tariff on those. But notably, those account for only a small portion of Japan's exports, so it's not the most material effect. Winners from the United States perspective include things such as rice farmers, where rice is now going to have greater access to Japan. Now, ironically enough, that might actually benefit Japanese consumers, in large part because there's been some concerns about inflation, particularly amongst staples like rice in Japan. So getting some of those prices down might, interestingly enough, be a bit of a vote winner for the government. Obviously not with the farmers, but with consumers more generally. Furthermore, the investment, it appears, at least the United States, wants a lot of the investment to be in high-tech areas, so that $550 billion. It appears that at least some of that's going to go towards semiconductors, presumably semiconductor manufacturing within the United States.
And this macro volatility just still hasn't gone away, Mark. With inflation still a major concern globally. How do you think this deal might impact price stability in the two countries?
Well, the more of these trade deals we see, the more certainty we get around what the trade environment is going to look like. And we're seeing very much a bedrock around that 15 to 20% area for most countries running a trade surplus with the United States. So it enables the market to calibrate where it thinks tariffs are going to be. And that stands in stark contrast to, say, April 2nd, where the range of tariffs was incredibly broad, but also there was a lot of uncertainty. So we're seeing, for example, VIX in the United States, it's actually been down over the past week, and indeed down throughout July, suggesting that the market has gotten more used to what these trade deals are going to look like and is less concerned, relatively speaking, about high tariffs undermining growth. Furthermore, if we look at the inflation data, the impact of tariffs hasn't yet showed up in inflation. I say yet because in reality there is going to be a lag effect, but that also gives some confidence to markets. Now, to be clear, in the United States, inflation still is about that 2.7%, according to PCE inflation, core PCE that is. So it's still too high for the Federal Reserve. Similarly, Australia has mentioned that inflation is stubbornly high, and admittedly it's in the RBA's target band in Australia, but still too high, or at least persistent. In addition, the EU has noted this when the ECB decided to not cut rates. So certainly there's still uncertainty, particularly concerns about whether tariffs will cause inflation, but the market has at least adjusted over the past month.
And you spoke there about markets getting used to President Trump and his administration's kind of strategies and policies. Do you think this deal signifies a broader pivot away from multilateralism, multilateral organizations, towards a US-led bloc trade strategy?
Certainly, the US appears to be doing more unilateral approaches to trade deals. So, for example, negotiating directly and specifically with individual countries. We've seen that with all the trade negotiations. And indeed, there doesn't appear to be a bloc or a holistic approach to this. And all countries coming up with different types of trade deals. Now, that, of course, does lead to these things slowing down quite a bit, as the United States need to negotiate individual deals. But we have seen the US very much cool on many international entities. Recently, in a slightly different context, for example, it walked away from UNESCO, arguing that it had been co-opted by parties that were not acting in the US taxpayers' interests. So the US is very much trying to bring itself front and center in these negotiations. And is an open question, because the US is trying to very much drive power in these negotiations while also reducing its role in global security. And the two often, at least historically, have gone hand in hand. So the US has a balancing act going forward. China, for its part, has also tried to increase its centrality in negotiations. But of course, many of its funding or loans come with some strings attached. So China is an alternative to the United States in some ways, but not necessarily a perfect alternative.
Mark, I want to ask you about other parts of the world, other markets, emerging economies, plenty of emerging economies in Asia, fast-growing economies in Africa, that I guess will be looking to leverage similar terms. Have they been left sidelined, or is it just purely a case that it's just not their turn yet?
Well, it will be something of both there, really. So if we're looking at Japan, for example, their trade deal was the culmination of reportedly about 8 rounds of talks. It had been going on since mid-April. If we look at Vietnam, Vietnam was one of the first countries to approach the United States for negotiations. And of course, it was one of the first trade deals. So we're seeing that the countries that really got on top of it very early and tried to negotiate have gotten deals. Africa has perhaps had less at the forefront with this, and therefore less bargaining power, but also it's been delayed a little bit, meaning that they are ultimately going to end up with a later trade deal. And we're also seeing that with other countries as well that have not made the effort to meet with President Trump. Australia, for example, while it was hit with a 10% tariff, it's still been trying to meet with President Trump about other trade negotiations, but it's simply not been making the effort required. So it's not just Africa, but it's other countries that potentially have gotten complacent as well.
And we know there have been concerns over tariffs, obviously supply chain issues, Fed policy. But do you think this deal overall has been reasonably well received by markets?
Certainly, the market does appear to be quite positive about it. So we're seeing generally in the United States, throughout the past week, which is when this trade deal was coming up, the S&P 500, the Nasdaq Composite were quite solid. Now, a good portion of this is earnings, because it is earnings season. We've got Alphabet, Tesla. Tesla was disappointing, but Alphabet did well. So that's also boosting the market. If we're looking at Japan, however, the auto manufacturers, well, their stock prices surged, and the Nikkei index also increased on this trade deal, suggesting the market was relieved about it. Now, granted, the market would probably prefer there to be 0% tariff, but relative to the other fears of a 25, 30% tariff, or maybe other punitive aspects of a trade deal, certainly this has been well received. And that also partly underscores why VIX had decreased in the United States as well.
And let's look ahead, Mark. You know, when we sort of look back on this in 12 months' time, do you think we'll conclude that this deal had been a stabilizing force in global trade, or do you think it'll be something that sort of helped accelerate a worrying fragmentation?
In some ways, we'll almost see both aspects to it. And it depends on what our counterfactual is. So say, for example, we take as a given that President Trump was going to tariffs, and those tariffs were going to exist. Well, then the trade deal itself is going to help to solidify stability, because it gives us a direction about where the trade deals will go. It gives us another precedent for how the other trade deals might be negotiated, and it gives us an idea about what the United States aims to achieve. Additional investment into the United States, additional preferential access to markets outside of the United States. So in that context, the deal itself is stabilizing. If we take as our counterfactual that tariffs didn't need to occur, then April 2nd and so-called Liberation Day, that was destabilizing. The tariffs, to some extent, have arguments for and against them. The main argument against them is we've got different tariffs with different countries. It adds to complexity. Furthermore, it does potentially increase cost for consumers. The United States, of course, would argue that many overseas countries have imposed non-trade barriers or have unfairly treated their countries, thereby necessitating tariffs. But nevertheless, the increase in tariffs has created a degree of fragmentation, but each deal that we get helps to solidify stability.
Mark, we appreciate your analysis very much indeed. Thank you very much for joining us on World Business. Well, that is all for this edition of World Business. From tariffs to trade alliances, then the US-Japan pact is more than a deal. It's a statement about the future of global markets. As nations react, the ripple effects will shape policies and profits for years to come. From all of us here at AnewZ, thanks for watching.